At 2:23 a.m. local time, Berdyansk looked like one of the most heavily protected helicopter bases in the south. 19 Ka-52s and Mi-8s, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, were packed onto the apron behind S-400 and Pantsir protection. In under 10 minutes, that same apron would be burning, helicopters would be destroyed where they stood, and the survivors would be racing for a runway they might never reach. Ukraine had the helicopters exactly where it wanted them. It still did not strike. Then the warning reached the base. Russia still had time to get them out. What the commander did next would decide whether those helicopters escaped, or were still on the ground when the real attack arrived. Over the previous 12 minutes, Berdyansk had been filling faster than Russian ground crews could turn the arriving helicopters around. A Ka-52 was still taxiing clear when a Mi-8 dropped onto final approach, while another gunship rolled toward an apron already crowded with fuel trucks, mechanics, and helicopters whose rotors had barely stopped turning. Above them, a Ukrainian reconnaissance UAV was doing more than counting aircraft. It was watching where each helicopter parked, which taxi lane it used, where the fuel trucks stopped, and how quickly the crews could prepare the next departure. 11 had become 14, 14 had become 17, then 19. In barely 12 minutes, the returning force had been compressed into an operating area only 430 meters long. Several aircraft were now 35 to 50 meters apart, putting more than $350 million in helicopters and support equipment onto the same narrow piece of concrete. Ukraine already had usable coordinates. It still did not strike. There was a reason to keep waiting. A Ka-52 in the air could change heading, altitude, and position almost immediately. Once it entered the turnaround cycle on the ground, everything changed. It needed a parking position, fuel, ground crews, clearance, and an open route back toward the runway. Landing had traded mobility for dependency. Then the target stopped being just the helicopters. A fuel truck pulled alongside one Ka-52. A tow tractor dragged a Mi-8 deeper into the apron. Another servicing vehicle moved in behind it. What Ukraine was watching now was not simply 19 aircraft. It was the system required to refuel them, reposition them, service them, and put them back into combat. But that opportunity was temporary. One Ka-52 was already nearing the end of its turnaround. Another crew was preparing for startup. Every extra minute made the concentration more valuable and brought Russia closer to breaking it apart. The Ukrainian operator kept watching. Hold. South of Berdyansk, the first Ram-2 kamikaze strike drone was already closing. Russia was preparing the helicopters to move. Ukraine was preparing to take that time away. At 2:24 a.m., one of the Ka-52s near the taxiway was already being cleared for startup. A fuel hose had come off, the ground crew was moving away, and the space in front of the helicopter was beginning to open. That was the signal Ukraine could no longer ignore. If another 5 or 6 minutes passed, the concentration below could start breaking apart. Fresh coordinates replaced the earlier target points. The strike team had what it needed. Then the order changed. Execute. South of Berdyansk, the Ram-2s dropped lower and accelerated toward the airfield. These were small Ukrainian kamikaze strike drones, carrying compact warheads and approaching low enough to force the defenses to deal with them close to the base. They were not being sent to hunt 19 helicopters one by one. Their first job was simpler. Keep those helicopters on the ground long enough for what came next to matter. Below, Russia was already trying to do the opposite. A fuel truck reversed away from one Ka-52, but had not yet cleared the aircraft behind it. A tow tractor was pulling a Mi-8 across the apron. Another crew was climbing into a cockpit. The distance kept collapsing, and the Russians were still working. Then the southern radar picture changed. Low, slow contacts appeared near the ground. The Pantsir, the system responsible for threats that had already pushed close to the airfield, began slewing toward them. Farther out, the S-400 network and its 92 N6 radar shifted attention toward the same sector. That reaction reached the apron almost immediately. Fueling stopped. Mechanics pulled away from open aircraft. One startup sequence was interrupted. The reversing fuel truck now blocked another helicopter from taxiing, turning a few seconds of warning into physical congestion on the ground. Ukraine had waited for Russia to build the concentration. Now the first attack was preventing Russia from taking it apart. But the opening had already begun to close. The Pantsir had found the Ram-2s. The Panzer had the first Ram 2 before the Russian crews fully understood the shape of the attack. The first useful tracks appeared at roughly 9.4 kilometers. 7 low returns closing on Berdyansk, just 70 to 80 meters above the ground. At their current speed, the defenders had less than 4 minutes to decide which contacts mattered most. One Ram 2 stood out. The Panzer operator could engage it immediately or keep searching for the weaker returns spreading away from it. Waiting gave the clearest target more distance. 8 kilometers, then 6. He took the shot. The Panzer fired, and seconds later, one Ukrainian drone disappeared from the radar picture. But while the crew was working that target, the warning was already reaching the apron. Fuel hoses were pulled clear. A mechanic left his tools beside an open Ka-52. 2 crews preparing for startup received the same order: hold position. The rotors stayed down. Another Ram 2 was intercepted, but the remaining drones kept pressing from separated angles. One broke through toward the support side of the base. Its warhead detonated beside communications equipment, supporting the local air defense network, forcing crews onto backup links while the remaining contacts were still closing. On the apron, the consequences were already visible. In roughly 140 seconds, the turnaround had come apart. Fuel hoses lay disconnected, maintenance work was abandoned, and helicopters that had been minutes from startup were still sitting with their rotors down. The airfield was no longer trying to return aircraft to combat. It was trying to survive the attack happening around them. One by one, the remaining Ram 2 tracks began dropping from the radar picture. The radar picture started clearing. Most of the helicopters were still intact. Now the Russian commander had 2 bad choices: send them up while another threat might still be outside, or keep them exactly where Ukraine wanted them. A Ka-52 near the taxiway already had its pilot strapped in. The chocks were out, the rotor was beginning to turn, and across the apron, a fuel truck was backing away from a Mi-8. The Panzer was still scanning the low sky. Then the radar report came through. No new low contacts. The Ka-52 crew was ready to move. The commander was not. If he launched now and another Ram 2 appeared outside the perimeter, nearly 20 helicopters could be caught during departure. If he waited, the aircraft would remain packed together on the ground. He chose to wait. The order reached the apron before the Ka-52 could taxi. Its rotor kept turning, but the helicopter stayed where it was. The Mi-8 behind it remained blocked. The fuel truck stopped near the edge of the operating area, while crews waited for clearance that did not come. Most of the 19 helicopters were still packed inside the main operating area. Under clean conditions, moving that many aircraft out would take roughly 12 to 15 minutes. Nearly 5 minutes had already disappeared into warning, shutdowns, interrupted servicing, and reorganization. And now more time was being spent proving the sky was safe. From the Russian side, that still looked reasonable. The Ram 2 tracks were gone, the S-400 launchers were still standing. The Panzer was still scanning. Most of the helicopters had not been hit. The first attack appeared to have failed. More than 150 kilometers away, 5 HIMARS were already waiting on separate firing points. Their crews were not waiting for Berdyansk to recover. They were waiting for the helicopters to stay exactly where they were. The hold order finally lifted. Get them airborne. The apron moved at once. Ground crews ran back between the helicopters. Chocks were dragged clear, and the Ka-52 nearest the taxiway began driving its rotors toward flight speed. Rotor wash kicked loose covers and dust across the concrete while a fuel truck reversed hard to clear the lane. But the first helicopter still could not leave. A Mi-8 remained boxed in by servicing equipment, and the fuel truck crossing the taxi route forced the Ka-52 ahead of it to wait. More than 158 kilometers away, 5 HIMARS were already firing. The first launcher flashed, then the second. Within seconds, 5 M39 ATACMS were climbing away from separated firing positions toward Berdyansk. Back on the apron, the fuel truck finally cleared. The first Ka-52 turned toward the taxiway. Behind it, another gunship was still spooling up. The Mi-8 had barely moved. Every second lost on the ground was now being traded against 5 ballistic missiles already covering the distance to the airfield. Then the command post received a new track. Not low, not slow, ballistic. The warning had reached the base, but the local air defense network was still recovering from the disruption left by the Ram 2 strike. The S-400 launchers were still standing. The system around them was not fully back. and the missiles were already closing. The Ram-2s had forced Russian crews to watch the low approaches. Now the same base had to deal with a ballistic threat, while most of the helicopter force was still trying to leave through the same few taxi routes. The warning spread across Berdyansk. Crews who had just run back to their aircraft were ordered away from the open apron again. One mechanic jumped clear of a KL-52 as its rotor continued turning. The first helicopter kept taxiing, but the aircraft behind it stopped moving. Russia had finally begun breaking the concentration apart. It had simply started too late. The first Ka-52 still had not reached the runway when the lead M39 tipped into its terminal descent above Berdyansk. The first M39 opened above the Ka-52 line before the lead helicopter reached the runway. The burst ripped across the apron, driving fragments through rotor blades, fuel tanks, and exposed ground equipment. The taxiing Ka-52 disappeared behind sparks, smoke, and shredded metal, while the aircraft behind it suddenly had no clear route out. Then the rest of the salvo arrived. Over the next seconds, the remaining 4 M39s opened across the servicing, support, and parking areas. Another wave of detonations ripped through the Mi-8 side of the apron. Fuel lines ruptured, fire rolled beneath parked aircraft, as a tow tractor and support vehicles began burning beside them. As the fire reached exposed fuel and equipment, the secondary explosions began. One flash punched through the smoke, another followed farther down the parking line. Burning fragments fell between vehicles, and crews trying to reach the helicopters were forced back as black smoke spread across the taxi routes. A surviving Ka-52 still had its rotors turning, but the tow vehicle beside it was burning. The route ahead was blocked, and the men around it were no longer trying to launch aircraft. They were trying to keep the fire from reaching the rest of the base. That was when the strike stopped being only about helicopters. As the smoke spread across the apron, the scale of the damage began to emerge. 19 aircraft had been present when the sequence began. In this scenario, roughly 10 were destroyed or damaged beyond immediate use, while another 5 or 6 were left unable to return quickly to operations. The aircraft, support equipment, and lost combat capacity together represented roughly 450 to 600 million. From the moment the warning reached Berdyansk to the first M39 airburst, less than 10 minutes had passed. The first Ka-52 had been visible long before the attack began. Hitting it then would have removed one target. Ukraine waited until helicopters, fuel, crews, and the machines required to keep them flying had gathered around the same apron. The Ram-2s then stole the minutes Russia needed to reverse that concentration. By the time the order finally came to leave, the M39s were already on the way. Ukraine did not need the first shot. It needed the last few minutes. If you had been commanding Berdyansk, would you have launched immediately after the Ram-2 attack, or waited until the sky looked clear? Tell me below.